It began the way things usually do when you're not expecting them at all, with the sound of the doorbell ringing while I was standing in the kitchen barefoot, wearing a robe that still had the grocery list scribbled in pencil stuffed inside, one pocket, holding a half-peeled cucumber in my left hand, and wondering whether or not I had the energy to cook something halfway decent that night, or if takeout would do again. And by the time I crossed the living room and reached for the handle, I was already regretting not brushing my hair that morning, already telling myself it would just be the delivery guy. And instead I opened the door to find him, my husband's son, standing on the welcome mat, with one hand on the handle of his suitcase and a familiar half-smile on his face that somehow made the hallway feel suddenly smaller. I hadn't seen him in more than 2 years, not since the last time he visited during winter break, when he still looked like a boy in oversized hoodies with his earbuds always in and his sentences cut short by boredom or politeness. But now he stood there noticeably changed, taller, broader in the shoulders, his expression calmer, more measured, like someone who had learned how to carry his body with a certain ease. And while none of it was particularly dramatic, the difference hit me in that quiet internal way certain changes do, not because they demand your attention, but because your body registers them before your brain has time to argue. He stepped inside with a quiet thank you, dragging the suitcase gently over the tiles like someone who already knew the layout of the home and didn't want to make noise. And as I turned to make space for him, feeling the cool draft from outside brushing the back of my legs where the robe didn't quite close, I realized how long it had been since anyone looked at me with that kind of open curiosity, not admiration exactly, and not flirtation, but something in between. The kind of glance that asks a question without waiting for the answer out loud. Then he leaned in, casually, like family should, and wrapped his arms around me in a hug that lasted just long enough to cross that invisible line between welcome and awareness. One arm around my middle, the other settling with gentle weight against my back, and I froze. Not because I didn't know how to react, but because in that split second, I realized I was thinking not of how to pull away politely, but of how it felt to be held, actually held with intention, and that thought alone unsettled me far more than the gesture itself. And of course, as if summoned by timing too precise to be real, the front door creaked open behind us, and my husband's voice filled the hallway with that casual, distracted tone he uses when he's juggling 10 thoughts at once, saying something about forgetting his laptop charger, and in the span of a single breath, I stepped back from the hug, adjusted the tie of my robe without looking down, and smiled too quickly. While his son turned toward the door with that relaxed greeting only adult children can offer, familiar but not intimate, respectful but lightly removed, and my husband, now halfway through the entryway with the charger already in hand, looked at the two of us with a gaze that flicked just a second too long, smiled that thin, unreadable smile he uses when something doesn't quite add up but isn't worth mentioning yet, and then, without a word of suspicion, said he had to run and that he'd call from the road, kissed my cheek like it was just another Tuesday, and left the house without closing the door all the way behind him. I stood there longer than necessary, pretending to listen to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock in the hallway, while my hands hovered around the coffee pot I hadn't touched yet, thinking not about the hug itself but about the way my heart had reacted. A small, sharp beat that didn't feel like guilt and didn't feel like warning either, just something sudden and physical that reminded me of myself, like when your foot hits the cold part of the bedsheet in winter and your whole body notices. Later, that day, after I'd changed into something more neutral, simple cotton leggings and an old t-shirt with a neckline that sat high enough to feel safe, sleeves pushed up just past my elbows, hair gathered back into something halfway presentable. I moved through the house the way I do when something's off, but I haven't named it yet. Cleaning surfaces that didn't need cleaning, refolding towels that had already been folded, opening and closing the fridge just to hear the door seal again, because the act of doing something familiar sometimes helps you forget the thing your body won't let go of. And even though I told myself I was just being silly, that nothing strange had happened, I couldn't stop hearing that pause in my husband's voice. Couldn't stop replaying the moment I had felt the quiet pressure of someone's hand across the small of my back and hadn't wanted it to end. I didn't talk to his son for the rest of the afternoon, not because I was avoiding him, or maybe I was, but mostly because I wasn't sure what my face would do if he looked directly at me again with that same expression. That calm, observant expression that didn't judge or invite, but simply acknowledged, like he saw me clearly and didn't feel the need to blink away from it. Dinner was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet you get when no one wants to admit how loud their thoughts are, and we ended up eating outside. On the patio, as we often did when the heat settled just enough by dusk, the mosquitoes hadn't arrived yet, and the city beyond the fence seemed to pause for a while, as if even the traffic had decided it was too tired to press forward. I set the table with the cloth napkins we usually saved for guests, poured the wine into the mismatched glasses we kept from our wedding set, and tried to lose myself in the small rituals of presentation, The angle of the fork, the alignment of the salt shaker. Anything that could distract me from the way my hands still carried that memory of him, just faintly, like a trace of perfume left on a borrowed coat. My husband talked about the new project his team was launching, something about quarterly reports and a delayed launch in Valencia, and I nodded at all the right places, laughed when he made the usual joke about Europeans never answering, emails after noon, even tossed in a "that's so true" in my most casual tone, but my eyes kept drifting to the other side of the table, where his son sat leaning slightly forward with his forearms resting along the edge of the chair, his glass held by the stem, not the bowl, the way people do when they've learned to be precise about the little things. And every time I glanced in his direction, I felt that quiet pull again. Not lust, not danger, but awareness. Deep, rooted, and entirely too present for comfort. When dinner ended and the plates had been cleared, I found an excuse to retreat upstairs, something about a headache or needing to stretch my back, and left the two of them to finish their wine and continue a conversation I didn't want to be part of anymore. Not because it was boring, but because I could feel myself losing grip on the version of the evening I was supposed to be in, and I knew I needed space to breathe, to wash my face slowly, to brush my teeth in silence and stare at my own reflection under the soft yellow light of the bathroom until my pulse stopped reacting to the sound of his voice from the floor below. I got into bed early, turned off the lamp before 9, and pulled the sheets up past my collarbone even though it wasn't cold, just to feel some kind of boundary. But my body wouldn't settle the way it usually did, and as I lay there beside the man I'd built this life with, the man who still kissed my forehead each morning and handed me my vitamins without ever forgetting, I realized I hadn't been touched with curiosity in a very long time. And I didn't mean sexually, not even romantically, but in the way someone looks at you when they aren't quite sure what you'll say next, and they like that about you. And it reminded me of something I couldn't name. Sleep didn't come easily that night, not because I was restless, but because for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to forget how I'd felt earlier. Not the guilt, not the hesitation, but the unmistakable, almost electric awareness of being seen by someone without being owned, without being categorized, and I lay there with my hands folded flat on my stomach, watching the moonlight shift across the ceiling, knowing deep down that something had moved inside me, something small, maybe even harmless, but real enough to notice. And once you notice a thing, you can't unsee it. The mornings began to shift without anyone announcing it, with the quiet sound of the fridge door opening before I even came downstairs, and the faint smell of something already sizzling. In the pan, butter maybe, or the start of scrambled eggs. And I remember the first time I saw him standing there barefoot in our kitchen, sleeves rolled up, his hair still damp from the shower, a dish rag tossed over his shoulder like he'd lived here all his life, even though technically it hadn't been more than 4 days. And something about the way he moved around the counter without checking where anything was made me pause at the bottom step just long enough to feel like I wasn't quite supposed to walk in yet. I eventually did, of course, pretending I was, just taking my time with the coffee machine, but the truth was I found myself lingering, not out of politeness or curiosity, but because watching him felt unexpectedly grounding, like the kind of quiet moment you stumble into that asks nothing from you except to witness it. And when he turned around to ask if I wanted toast, I nodded and thanked him too quickly, my voice a little higher than usual, and I could tell he noticed, not because he said anything, but because his smile held that half-second pause people have when they register something they're not sure they should mention. Over the next few days, our patterns kept overlapping in ways that felt coincidental, but never quite accidental. Like the way we always seemed to end up in the hallway at the same time, him reaching for the laundry basket while I came around the corner with fresh towels, or how I'd walk into the living room just as he was switching off the TV and folding the blanket we kept on the armrest. And even though I told myself we were simply sharing space like any two adults would, I started noticing how I stayed a little longer near the sink if he was still drying the plates, or how I suddenly remembered I had something to check on my phone but didn't leave the room, and none of it was dramatic or inappropriate, but it was real, and it sat in the air between us like a low-frequency hum I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while tidying the drawer near the dining table where we kept old bills and expired coupons, he pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in years, thin sheets of tracing paper, some smudged pencil drawings, a few color swatches clipped to the corner with a rusted paper clip, and I felt my stomach tighten as he asked, not casually, but with genuine interest, whether I had done them. And when I nodded, brushing hair from my face more out of habit than necessity, I explained that I used to work in interior design before I took a break, before the marriage, before the house became a job in itself. And while I talked, he didn't interrupt. He didn't look distracted. He just stood there, flipping through the pages slowly, like they mattered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like more than someone's wife folding bath towels and scheduling oil changes. That night, after a long day of errands and a quiet dinner, none of us had the energy to cook from scratch. I curled up on the corner of the couch with a light blanket around my legs, scrolling through an old photo album I'd pulled from the shelf, not because I missed the memories, but because I wanted something with texture in my hands. And without saying anything, he came over, holding the thicker throw blanket we kept for winter nights, and laid it gently over my shoulders with both hands, his fingers brushing the side of my neck in a way that felt unintentional, but lingered just long enough to catch my breath mid-scroll. I didn't look up right away, pretending to adjust the edge of the album, but the skin along my arms had already reacted, that low hum again spreading outward from the point of contact. And when I finally glanced at him, he had already turned, walking back to the hallway, not fast, not slow, as if it hadn't meant anything. And maybe for him it hadn't. But I sat there for a long time after that, not reading the captions under the photographs, not flipping pages, just letting the warmth of the blanket sink in, unsure whether it came from the wool or the gesture itself. Later that evening, after they both went to bed and the house fell into that gentle kind of silence only a lived-in place can hold, I ran a hot bath, not for sore muscles or relaxation, but because I needed to be alone in a room with a closed door, where the mirror didn't reflect anyone else's expectations, and as I sat in the water with my knees drawn close and the steam fogging up the corners of the glass, I didn't feel guilt, not exactly. I felt a nervous energy I couldn't place, something that tightened and loosened inside me in waves. And even though I told myself nothing had happened, my body was still reacting like it had. By the time I stepped out and dried myself slowly with the oversized towel we'd gotten years ago during a weekend trip I barely remembered, my phone buzzed on the sink with a message from my husband, the BYA, words short and perfectly spaced like always. "How's everything there? Hope you two are getting along well." And I stared at it for a while without moving, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because no answer felt quite right. I waited until the screen dimmed, then typed slowly, "Everything's calm, thanks for checking," and I put the phone face down on the counter. I moved through the hallway with the towel still wrapped around my shoulders, my hair dripping in slow lines down the curve of my back, my skin still tingling from the bath in a way that wasn't about temperature, not fully about heat or cool air, but about that unsettled state the body enters when something has shifted just slightly below the surface. And even though the house was quiet, even though I heard nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of old wood, I kept expecting a door to open, a question to be asked, or even footsteps that would break the stillness, but none came, and that silence wrapped around me heavier than the towel itself. I went into the bedroom without turning on the main light, letting only the glow from the hallway spill across the carpet, and as I stood by the bed, folding the edge of the blanket down with fingers that felt too aware of themselves, I caught my reflection in the mirror above the dresser, not all of it, just enough to see the side of my face and the line of my arm, and for a second I didn't recognize the way I was holding myself. Shoulders slightly lifted, spine straight, but not stiff, eyes wide but not afraid. And I realized it had been a very long time since I had noticed my own presence in a room before anyone else did. The towel slipped from my shoulder as I moved to sit down, but I didn't fix it, didn't pull it back into place because the cool air on my skin felt like something I had earned, like a reminder that I was still alive inside my own body. And when I finally lay down, pulling the sheets up to my chest, and tucking one arm under the pillow, I didn't close my eyes right away, not because I wasn't tired, but because the thoughts in my head weren't ready to settle yet. They kept circling like birds over a field, not attacking, not screaming, just waiting to land. I thought about the way he looked at those sketches, not flipping through them quickly like people usually do when they're just being polite, but studying them, holding each one carefully as if it might say something important, and the way he had asked questions without making me feel like I had to prove anything. Not about timelines or degrees or clients, just about color and space and the feeling of light across a wall. And I couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to me about something I made without linking it to something I owed. I thought about the way our fingers had touched over the back of that blanket, not brushing by accident, not grazing, in passing, but meeting, pausing, pressing just long enough for my body to feel the shape of his knuckle against my own, and the way he didn't say anything after, didn't turn it into a moment or a joke or a question, just left it there, as if that silence was enough, and in some strange way, it was. I thought about how I had begun standing differently in the kitchen, how I started choosing blouses that didn't hang so loosely, not tight or revealing, nothing out of character, just things I hadn't reached for in months, fabrics that felt like a second skin instead of a cover-up, colors that brought out the line of my shoulders or the curve of my waist, and even though no one said anything, not even him, I saw the shift in the way he looked at me once or twice and I wasn't sure what unsettled me more, the attention, or how much I didn't want it to stop. I lay there breathing slowly, trying to name the feeling that had taken root behind my ribcage, something too sharp to be comfort and too soft to be fear. And I understood then that this wasn't about flirtation or fantasy or some forbidden line. It was about the fact that someone in this house had started seeing me with new eyes, and the more I noticed it, the more I started seeing myself differently too. Not younger, not better, just clearer, as if I had been walking around fogged over for years and the glass was finally beginning to clear. And still, I said nothing. I kept moving through the days with practiced grace, answering questions, folding laundry, replying to group texts, buying groceries, cooking dinner, keeping the rhythm of the house going like nothing had changed, because technically it hadn't. Not on the surface, not in the ways that counted to outsiders, but beneath all of that. Inside the quiet gestures and the unspoken seconds between movement, something had definitely shifted, and once it does, there's no easy way back to before. That weekend, my husband texted again, checking in with the same briefness he always used when traveling. No calls, no emojis, no video chats, just short phrases like, "Everything okay?" or "Need anything?" And I replied with the same distance I'd been keeping lately, choosing words like "all good" and "just the usual," pretending they meant something when I no longer felt entirely sure what the usual even was. And when he responded with, "I knew you two would get along," followed by a thumbs up, I stared at the screen without blinking, my finger hovering over the keyboard, then finally typed, "It's been calm. Thanks for checking." And as I set the phone down beside the bed and clicked the screen black again, I sat there a moment longer in the silence, not smiling, not frowning, just existing in the strange, suspended space between what I was supposed to feel and what I had actually begun to feel. And as I turned off the lamp and slid under the blanket that now felt too heavy across my legs, I knew deep down that calm was no longer the right word, because I had started to feel very awake, and I didn't know what that meant yet, only that I wasn't ready to forget it. The rain started without warning sometime after 7, not a drizzle, or the kind of polite tapping that comes and goes, but a sudden, full-bodied summer storm that threw itself against the windows and rattled the metal gutter in sharp gusts. And I remember standing in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the water pour off the balcony railing in steady sheets, knowing without looking at the forecast that it wouldn't stop anytime soon. And for a brief moment, I felt grateful for the excuse it gave me, the way a storm makes the rest of the world irrelevant, like time itself can wait until the downpour finishes speaking. My husband was out of town again, something to do with a client retreat or a planning session that required 3 days in a different time zone and a set of formal clothes I hadn't seen him wear in months. And while I usually counted the hours until his return without noticing, that evening I felt something different. Something that wasn't loneliness or freedom or even nervousness, just a kind of quiet anticipation that had settled low in my spine and didn't go away even when I moved through the house switching off unused lights. The internet went out not long after the thunder started, the kind of blackout that takes everything with it. Router, streaming, music, even the hallway motion lights. And after we checked the fuses and tried restarting the modem like people always do even though they know it won't help, we gave up without much effort, and I found myself suggesting we grab one of the big quilts from the upstairs closet and sit outside just to listen, not because I particularly wanted to talk or share a moment, but because the idea of being still in the presence of weather felt oddly necessary, like my body wanted to be near something that made noise loud enough to drown out thought. I changed into a soft, thin sweater that clung slightly to the skin where the humidity had already begun to creep indoors, and a pair of loose cotton pants I usually wore when I didn't plan on seeing anyone. And by the time I stepped out onto the balcony, the cushions on the bench were already damp from wind-blown mist, the air thick with the smell of concrete and ozone and the metallic weight of summer rain. And when he joined me with 2 mugs of tea, wearing a plain t-shirt that had soaked through at the shoulders from the short dash across the courtyard to bring in the clothesline I'd forgotten about, I took one look at him and felt a sudden flash of heat that had nothing to do with the weather. He handed me the cup slowly, not like someone offering a drink, but like someone passing a thought from one set of hands to another. And when my fingers curled around the ceramic and brushed against his, I noticed immediately that he didn't pull away, didn't retreat into politeness, didn't shift his weight or make a casual remark. He just stood there, eyes focused, steady, waiting for me to react or not react. And I didn't move either, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to break the current that had somehow built itself around the space between us, like the pressure before lightning. We sat down without speaking, shoulder to shoulder but not touching, both of us wrapped in the same heavy quilt I had pulled from the storage bench earlier, and for several minutes we said nothing, just listened to the rhythm of the rain pounding against the railing, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant roll of thunder somewhere far, beyond the rooftops, and I remember thinking how rare it is to sit in silence with someone and feel more seen than during an entire dinner full of conversation, how certain people's presence can fill the air without words and still leave you breathless. When I turned, To look at him, slowly, like someone shifting in a dream they're afraid of waking from, I found him already looking at me. His face calm, unreadable, eyes dark in the low light. And even though neither of us said anything, I felt something unspoken rise between us like steam off the edge of a kettle. Slow and inevitable, not rushed, not dramatic, just real in the way things are when you no longer have a reason to pretend. His hand moved first. Not toward me exactly, but just slightly, resting on the bench between us, his fingers open, relaxed, not demanding anything, but offering something without explanation, and my breath caught as I shifted the cup to my other hand and let mine drift closer, not on purpose, not by plan, but because it felt like gravity, like water following the slope of the earth. And when our fingers finally touched again, skin to skin without ceramic between us, the world narrowed into a pinpoint of sensation that erased every rational boundary I had spent years learning to maintain. I didn't look away when he leaned in, didn't flinch or laugh or turn my face. I just held still, watching him come closer, like watching the ocean pull back before a wave, slow and deliberate. And when his lips met mine, it was not explosive or hurried, but slow, unbearably slow. The kind of kiss that feels like an answer to a question you didn't know you had asked. And I felt my hand press against his chest lightly, not to stop him, but to steady myself, because everything inside me had started to tremble at once. The kiss unfolded not like a scene from a movie or a memory waiting to happen, but more like the slow unraveling of a tightly folded thought, like something that had been hidden in the corners of the mind so long that when it finally rose to the surface, it did so without urgency, without drama, with the kind of quiet certainty that needs no permission, only space to exist. And as his lips moved against mine with the careful steadiness of someone who wasn't sure if they were being allowed or simply not stopped, I felt my own response come not from decision but from something far deeper, something closer to breath than desire, something that felt almost like recognition. There was no sound except the hush of the rain beyond the balcony and the muffled throb of my own pulse filling the spaces where logic used to live. And when I tilted my head slightly, letting the kiss lengthen just enough to lose track of its beginning, I didn't think about where we were or what time it was or even who we were supposed to be to each other. I only thought about how long it had been since I had felt this still, this present, this undeniably connected to the shape of my own mouth against another's. He didn't rush, didn't tighten his grip or press closer. He just stayed exactly where he was, lips moving with a reverent softness, one hand lightly brushing the outside of my wrist like he was afraid to ask for more than that. And I kept my eyes closed, not because I was afraid to see, but because the inside of that moment was louder than anything my vision could provide. And in that enclosed, rain-wrapped stillness, the world became a room without corners. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Not long in any measurable way, but long enough for the air between us to change texture. Long enough for the scent of rain-soaked cotton and black tea to imprint itself somewhere in my memory permanently. Long enough for my fingers to memorize the angle of his collarbone beneath, the damp fabric of his shirt. And when the kiss finally ended, not with a pull or a shift, but with a shared pause, the kind that comes when two people arrive at the same conclusion without saying it, I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with temperature, just the body realizing that what had been warm was no longer in contact. He leaned back slowly, breathing through his nose like someone waking from a dream too fragile to name, and, even though he didn't speak, his expression held everything I couldn't say out loud. Not apology, not regret, just that raw, honest awareness of what we had done. Not in terms of action, but in the shift of what was now possible, what could no longer be denied, what could not be untangled by time or distraction or polite smiles over shared meals. I looked down at my hands, still curled around the mug, now half cold, the steam long vanished, and when I stood up, I did so with care, as if the act of movement itself might undo the balance of the night, and I didn't say anything, didn't excuse myself or pretend to check the time. I simply stepped away from the blanket, from the bench, from him, and walked slowly back into the house, my footsteps almost soundless against the damp floor tiles, every nerve awake, every breath measured, as if I were carrying something fragile that no one could see. I didn't turn on any lights, didn't look back to see if he was watching, didn't pause in the hallway to listen for movement. I just made my way to the bedroom, pushed the door open with the side of my hand, and closed it gently behind me, letting the soft click of the latch mark the end of what had just happened. Or at least the end of how it would live on the outside, because inside me nothing had ended at all. Something had only begun. I sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, not undressing, not moving, just letting the quiet wrap around me like a second skin, and as the rain continued outside, steady and endless, I touched my lips with the back of my fingers, not to erase the sensation but to remember it, And for the first time in a very long while, I allowed myself to feel without commentary, without shame, without the dull internal lecture that usually followed any moment I couldn't justify. And I sat there for what must have been 15, maybe 20 minutes, not because I was waiting for anything to happen next, but because I couldn't imagine what anything after this was supposed to feel like. Eventually, I slid beneath the covers without removing my sweater, not out of modesty, but because my skin still felt full, as if undressing would only expose the echo of that kiss too much. And I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the shifting sounds of a house that had held too many silences and too few risks. And as I folded my hands under my cheek and pressed my knees together beneath the sheet, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace, not clarity, but the end of pretending I didn't want to feel anything at all. Sleep didn't come easily, not because I was afraid of what I had done, but because I was afraid of how much I didn't want to take it back. And even though I told myself I would think differently in the morning, that everything always looks less tempting after rest and daylight and routine, I knew in the deepest part of my chest that this night would not fade, not soften, not disappear like most uncomfortable memories do, because it hadn't come from weakness or confusion or even impulse. It had come from something quiet and alive and deeply, painfully real, and that, I realized, was far more dangerous than desire. I woke before the sun had finished lifting itself over the roofline, not because of any alarm or obligation, but because my body had grown too full of unspoken things to sleep properly. And as I lay there on my side beneath the weighted silence of our shared comforter, I could hear the slow, even breath of my husband behind me, his presence familiar in the way old songs become background noise, steady and expected. His body stretched diagonally across the mattress the way he always slept after travel, his hand resting palm down on his side of the bed as if claiming territory he never questioned. And I turned my face toward the window, blinking into the slow light of morning, realizing how heavy my limbs felt. Not from exhaustion, but from the strange kind of tension that settles in after something happens that can't be undone. When I finally sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floor felt cooler than it should have for a July morning. And as I padded quietly to the mirror above the dresser, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection without preparation, without soft lighting or distraction, and I saw it right away. The faint puffiness under my eyes, the dullness at the edges of my lips, the way my hair had twisted itself into something more chaotic than careless, but also something else, something less visible but more immediate, like a shadow behind the eyes that doesn't belong to sadness exactly, more like recognition or guilt dressed in stillness. And for a second, I looked at that version of myself and didn't flinch. Not because I liked what I saw, but because it felt honest. Downstairs, the smell of dark roast filled the kitchen before I even reached the last step. The machine already brewing its second cup like muscle memory had triggered it on my way down, and I moved through the familiar routine without speaking, grabbing 2 mugs from the rack, pouring slowly, setting 1 cup down on the far end of the counter without looking toward the hallway, because I knew he was there, or had been, or would be any second, and I didn't want our eyes to meet. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I wasn't sure what my face might say if it did, and I wasn't ready to say anything yet. The silence between us was not cold or aggressive, not hostile or even heavy. It was simply thick with the kind of awareness that lives just beneath language, the kind that doesn't need to be named to be felt. And every movement I made, from spooning sugar into my cup to adjusting the sleeves of my sweater, felt observed, not openly, not invasively, but closely enough that I had to remind myself to breathe through the center of my chest instead of the top of my throat. Later that day, after the hours had passed in quiet household tasks and an overlong grocery run, I took mostly for the distraction. My husband returned home from the office with that familiar combination of tired energy and effortful cheer, kissed my cheek with the same dry-lipped quickness he always used on busy days, and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. Something casual, nothing fancy. Just the 2 of us catching up over wine and food we didn't cook, and I agreed with a nod and a smile too practiced to feel dishonest. And even though I wanted to ask where this sudden interest had come from, I didn't, because part of me wanted the evening to go well, or at least to resemble something I could call normal. The restaurant was one of those mid-priced places with dim lighting and upholstered booths meant to suggest intimacy without expectation. The kind of space where the music is just loud enough to keep silence from feeling awkward, but quiet enough that no one has to raise their voice. And we ordered without hesitation, like people who have memorized each other's preferences through years of repetition. And as he talked about a woman in his department who had filed for divorce, describing how her husband had seemed shocked, how no one saw it coming, how everyone had assumed they were fine because they still vacationed together, and sent out holiday cards, I stirred my drink slowly with a paper straw and nodded in the right places, offering small affirmations like, "That's sad," and "I guess you never know." even though the only thing I could think about was how strange it was that he didn't see the irony in what he was saying. When the food arrived, I focused on my plate, not out of hunger but out of the need to ground myself in something physical, something tangible I could manage, because the conversation had begun to feel like an echo of a life I used to participate in more fully, and I realized as I chewed and swallowed that I wasn't really listening anymore, not because I didn't care, but because the words were starting to drift past me like traffic through a closed window, steady and meaningless, and I kept smiling when I needed to, kept responding when it made sense, but inside I was somewhere else entirely. That night, when we returned home and the kitchen lights cast long shadows across the tile, I moved through the house with the deliberate care of someone who doesn't want to disturb dust, not because of fear or secrecy, but because the stillness had become something sacred, something I didn't want to explain or interrupt. And as I reached for the tea towels to wipe down the counter, I noticed something small beside the sugar bowl, a square wooden coaster, hand-painted in uneven strokes of blue and green, the kind of unevenness that comes from a child's effort rather than an adult's precision. And as I picked it up with my fingertips, turning it over once to confirm the small faded name on the bottom edge, I recognized it immediately as the gift he had made for his mother back in school, the one I remembered seeing tucked into her old kitchen drawers years ago, and I felt a slow rise in my chest that wasn't panic, but something colder. I stood there for longer than necessary, holding that small wooden coaster between my fingers, the rough edges catching slightly against my skin, the faded paint still, showing traces of what used to be a sun in the corner, though now it looked more like a pale orange smear against a background of uncertain blue. And as I stared at the childish lettering on the back, that uneven scrawl of his name written, in marker that had since bled into the grain, I felt something shift in my stomach. Not a drop exactly, not a jolt, but a slow, weighted settling that made me place it back on the counter with too much care, like it might shatter if I wasn't gentle, even though I knew it couldn't break. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, leaving it there without asking questions, allowing the strange coincidence to remain unexplained. But something about the quietness of the gesture, the quietness of him placing it there without a word, unsettled me more than confrontation ever could. So I walked down the hallway toward the guest room, my feet almost silent against the floor, my hand hovering at the doorframe before I knocked. Once, not loudly, just enough for the rhythm to suggest I wasn't passing by, but that I also wasn't sure what I was doing there. And when I heard the muffled sound of his voice saying, "Come in," I stepped inside like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. He was seated at the edge of the bed with his back half turned toward me, the glow from the desk lamp throwing a soft amber halo over the side of his jaw, and he looked up when he saw me, his expression open but unreadable, the kind of look people wear when they know why you've come but aren't going to be the first to say it. And I held his gaze for a second longer than was polite, then let my eyes fall to the object in my hand, lifting it slightly as I asked, not accusingly, but not casually either, why this was sitting in the kitchen next to the sugar bowl. Why something I remembered being buried in his mother's drawer had suddenly appeared in my house like it belonged there, and I watched the corners of his mouth shift slightly before he spoke. He didn't hesitate long, didn't stumble over his words, didn't smile in that way people do when they're trying to smooth over tension. He just said it quietly and directly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I thought you'd like it." And even though his tone was light, almost offhanded, the words landed in me with more force than I expected, because they bypassed logic and went straight into something more fragile, something that had nothing to do with coasters or kitchen counters and everything to do with the way I had started to feel seen in this house in a way I hadn't been in years. I wanted to say something simple, something easy like thank you or that was thoughtful, but I couldn't find the voice to make it sound natural. So instead, I took a small step back and glanced toward the window, pretending to notice the movement of the curtain or the way the light flickered on the wall. And in that moment, I realized my hands had begun to tremble slightly, just enough for the coaster to feel heavier in my grip. And without thinking, I brought it down to my side and tucked it behind my hip, hiding it like something stolen, even though I knew no one had accused me of anything. He stood slowly, not in a way that suggested threat or approach, but in a way that made the space between us feel fuller, not closer, but more present. And I looked up at him because I didn't want to seem like I was retreating, didn't want to give him the impression that I was afraid, when really what I felt was far more complicated, a kind of tightening under my ribs that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the memory of his hand brushing mine on the balcony, the sound of rain behind us, the softness of that kiss that had never quite left my mouth since. When I didn't say anything right away, when I didn't ask any follow-up questions or try to turn the moment into something polite, he nodded once, a small gesture that felt like an acknowledgement of something shared, and he sat back down, this time with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped, eyes focused on a spot on the floor. And I knew then that whatever existed between us had grown roots too deep for surface language to handle, that we had crossed into a territory where nothing said out loud could equal what was being lived in silence. I left the room without another word, stepping backward with a tight grip on the coaster in one hand, and my other hand pressed against my side as if I needed to hold myself together physically. And as I passed back down the hallway toward the kitchen, I placed it back where I had found it. The painted sun turned slightly inward, so the name no longer faced up, and I stood there staring at it for a few seconds, willing my breath to slow, my chest to soften, the rising pressure behind my sternum to dissolve into something manageable. Later that evening, after the dishwasher had finished its cycle, and my husband had gone upstairs with his tablet under one arm and a yawn halfway down his throat, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't want, the light above me casting a yellow ring on the polished wood, and I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers clenched tighter than I meant them to be, because I could still feel the moment when he said he thought I'd like it, and something about the way he said it kept replaying in my head, not like a memory, but like a question I hadn't answered. I didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't pace the floor, or write anything down. I just sat there as the night pressed in around me, my shoulders stiff, my knees drawn close, my heartbeat steady but not calm, and I understood in that hour more than ever that whatever had begun between us wasn't something that would disappear on its own, that the silence we were both keeping was not a delay but a choice, and that choices once made have a way of becoming permanent even before they're acted on. And still, I stayed quiet. And still, I let the coaster remain exactly where he left it. That evening began like any other. Slow midweek night in early August, the kind of warm, slightly humid evening where nothing remarkable seems destined to happen, where the weather carries the weight of something tired and the air feels thick around your wrists and ankles. And I remember standing at the edge of the kitchen island watching the way the light hit the granite counter in a way that made it look more expensive than it actually was, while the sound of the stove fan mixed with the gentle crackle of oil meant dinner was almost ready. And my husband, sleeves rolled above his elbows, stood at the stovetop turning the fillets of white fish he'd marinated that morning, making quiet comments about the heat level and whether or not the edges were crisp enough. And even though I nodded and answered when appropriate, my attention was divided between the sensation of the dress I had chosen to wear and the tension behind my ribs that hadn't dissolved since I pulled it over my shoulders. It was a pale, linen dress with thin straps and a low back that gathered slightly at the waist, something I hadn't worn since the end of last summer, not because I had forgotten about it, but because it hadn't felt necessary, and when I reached for it earlier, that afternoon, pulling it from the back of the closet where it hung with the faint scent of citrus from last year's perfume, I hadn't thought about who might see it or what message it might send. I just knew I wanted something that felt easy on my skin and didn't remind me of the sweaters I'd worn during every dinner over the past month. And now, standing barefoot in that kitchen with the hem brushing the tops of my knees, I could feel the way it clung to my sides each time I leaned forward, how the fabric shifted with every breath, how the air moved around my shoulder blades, in a way that made me constantly aware of my own shape. The meal itself came together in quiet partnership, with me plating the salad and setting the cutlery while he arranged the fish with a touch of parsley, a habit he'd picked up years ago from some cooking video that claimed garnishing made food taste better, and the three of us sat down at the table with the kind of automatic rhythm that comes from familiarity rather than intention, the kind that doesn't need to be discussed or praised, it just happens. Chairs pulled out at the right moment, napkins passed without asking, wine poured carefully into glasses that hadn't been used in weeks, and the conversation stayed light and domestic, touching on travel delays, a neighbor's renovation, and whether the basil on the windowsill needed replacing. All while I kept my eyes mostly on my plate, avoiding too much direction in either gaze, not out of guilt or discomfort, but because the weight of my thoughts had begun pressing inward, folding me into myself in a way that felt both grounding and dangerous. After dinner, as my husband cleared the dishes into the sink and glanced at his phone with that low sigh he used whenever an international meeting was scheduled too late in the day, he mentioned a client from Warsaw who had requested a quick video check-in before signing the next phase of a deal, and I nodded with practiced understanding while I wiped down the edge of the table, already knowing he would excuse himself for at least 30 minutes and take the call from the back office where the light was better and the background quieter. And sure enough, a few minutes later, he excused himself politely, kissed the top of my head with barely there contact, and walked away with his laptop already open and his expression already distant. And the moment he disappeared down the hallway, the air around the kitchen seemed to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a held breath finally allowed to exhale. That night, his son didn't come down for dinner, even though the kitchen smelled like garlic and roasted vegetables, and the kind of pasta he always asked for when he was tired. And I didn't go upstairs to check on him, or knock on his door, or call his name down the hallway because I already knew he wouldn't answer. already felt the gap that had opened between us. Not dramatic or loud or final, just real. And the next morning his room was clean, the closet half empty, the sheets folded, and the smell of his shampoo had faded into the wood. He left just like he had arrived, without announcement, without a word, without permission. The silence that followed his departure wasn't dramatic or sharp or full of echoes the way it sometimes is in stories people tell about being left. It was just complete in that soft, airtight kind of way that settles around objects and routines when they no longer have a witness. And even though the house still smelled faintly like garlic and detergent and someone else's cologne, I couldn't feel the presence of anything human in it anymore. As if whatever thread had held us all in orbit had finally snapped without making a sound. And now everything, the chairs, the bedsheets, the shoes by the door, just existed without context. I didn't move much that day, not because I couldn't, or because grief had locked my body in place, but because movement no longer seemed to lead anywhere. And even walking from the bedroom to the kitchen felt like tracing the perimeter of something hollow, like pacing the edges of a decision that had already been made for me by people who weren't coming back to explain it. And when I finally opened my laptop to check my email, not for any particular reason, but out of the habit of still pretending to be part of some wider world, I noticed a small red icon in the corner of my banking app that I didn't recognize. First, I thought it was a glitch, maybe poor internet or a delay in the update. But when I clicked through, I saw clearly that my account had been restricted. Not empty, not closed, just silently locked, like someone had reached through a screen and pressed pause on my access to the life I thought I still had. And I refreshed the page more than once. Not because I believed it would change, but because disbelief is a kind of muscle memory. And when the results stayed the same, I closed the laptop gently, like closing a door I wasn't sure I would be allowed to open again. There was no note, no email, no text explaining the change, but it didn't feel like punishment or anger or revenge. It felt like the final piece of a quiet dismantling, like the last drawer being emptied without a sound. And I realized then that he hadn't done this to hurt me. He had done it to make it clear, to draw the line not in emotion but in structure, to remove not just his body from this space, but the web of practical ties that had once kept me woven into the center of his decisions. Didn't call him, I didn't call anyone. I didn't speak at all. There's a kind of silence that comes not from peace and not from shock, but from a body finally understanding that it no longer needs to explain itself. And I sat in that silence, with my legs pulled up onto the sofa, my arms wrapped lightly around my knees, breathing in and out like I used to do in the morning before anyone else woke up, when the world still felt like it was mine. And the only noise I made was the sound of my own lungs remembering how to keep going, even when everything familiar had gone quiet. Later, as the afternoon faded into the kind of evening that doesn't know what season it belongs to, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the wall where our portrait used to hang. The one we had taken during our 5th anniversary trip to the coast, the one with wind in my hair and his hand barely touching the small of my back. And I saw that it was gone. Not replaced, not reframed, just gone. And in its place was a bare hook slightly bent to the left, as if someone had removed the frame quickly, but not carelessly, and left behind only the trace of where connection used to live. I stood there, for a long time, not crying, not thinking, not even remembering, just staring at that hook and wondering how something so small could hold the entire weight of what had ended. And eventually I reached out, not to remove it, not to fix it, but just to touch it. Just to feel something cold and real beneath my fingers. And in that moment, I understood that closure doesn't come in words or gestures or goodbyes. It comes in noticing what's missing and realizing no one plans to replace it. The room didn't feel empty. It felt exact. It felt like a sentence that had reached its period and didn't need to continue. That night, I washed the last of the dishes by hand, one plate, one glass, one fork. My movements slow, but not weak. The kind of slow that happens when everything you do is being done for the first time without an audience. And when I turned off the light over the sink and walked to the bedroom, I didn't bother to fold the blanket at the foot of the bed, didn't check the locks, didn't look in the mirror. I just lay down, pulled the sheet over my chest, and let the silence do what it came here to do. Not erase, not explain, not soothe, but remain, without a trace, without a word, without me.